Hi everyone, I'm Hillary Gardner. I'm joining from Atlanta, Georgia. I graduated from the ILR school in 2006, and I've organized this book club twice a year for the past few years. And we've been very glad to host ILR professors as well as alumni authors and other professors with books that have been published by ILR imprint of Cornell University Press. And when this book was suggested by ILR Alumni Association President Nicole Moore-Millo, she also made the link for us to partner with Xóchitl, which is how we connected with Ketty. And thank you, Ketty, for joining us and for expanding our reach. And I'd like to extend a huge thank you to our authors, Shannon, Gleeson, and Xochitl Bada, who made themselves available and agreed to present to us and answer our questions. Shannon Gleeson is a professor at Cornell University School of Industrial and Labor Relations and the Brooks School of Public Policy. She's the author of Precarious Claims, The Promise and Failure of Workplace Protections in the United States. Xochitl Bada is a professor of Latin American and Latino Studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and she's the author of Mexican Hometown Associations in Chicagoacan, From Local to Transnational Civic Engagement. Now I'll turn to Ketty to say a few words.
Thank you so much for organizing this. As an ILRE myself, 97, thrilled to be a part of this. I had shared Xóchitl have had the great opportunity and fortune to have Professor Gleeson in an in-person event that we had before on campus. And so we were so excited when you offered us the opportunity to partner with you on this and invite Xóchitl. So I have the good fortune of being the president of the Cornell Latino Alumni Association. And as we prepare to celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month, which is September 15th and October 15th, we sent a message to our community to invite everyone to reflect on the richness and resilience of our community. And thinking of this month as more than just a cultural celebration, but rather as a reminder of the contributions that Latinos have made and continue to make across every sector of our life. From the arts and sciences to business and public service, our stories are woven into the nation's fabric. It's also time to honor the sacrifices of past generations who paved the way and to recognize the responsibility we hold in passing on our language, traditions, and values to future generations. At a moment when principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion are being questioned, celebrating our heritage is both an act of pride and of affirmation. Our voices, perspectives, and achievements matter, not just within the Latino community, but in shaping a more just and inclusive society for all. Hispanic Heritage Month offers us an opportunity to stand together, to educate others about the breadth of our contributions, and to reaffirm our commitment to equity, representation, and belonging. So we wanted to really get a chance to take the time to uplift this heritage, to celebrate one another, and to participate in this event as one of the first to kick off our celebration of Hispanic Heritage Month. And so thank you again, professors, for taking the time, and thank you to Cornell and Hillary for your leadership in making this possible.
Well, thanks everyone. It's nice to see someone other than academics interested in our work, to be honest, and the captive audience of our students. We are really thrilled to talk with you all, especially in the moment in which we find ourselves. I want to say just a few words about the book itself, just to peel back the veil of what collaborations require. And in this case, this has been a project in the making for over almost 13 years, and Xochitl and I have been collaborators throughout that time. And it's a real testament to how important finding like great people to work with is. And so I just really want to extend gratitude to Xochitl and also to the broader team that we assembled, which includes a lot of ILR undergraduates, and which I know several of you are, and graduate students, so as well as at UIC. So this is a project which is primarily focused on trying to understand the locus of migrant rights, not only in the United States, but also in various what we would call sending states, and the largest of which is Mexico, and trying to understand what role the Mexican state has played in trying to manage migration is the term that's often used, and how it came to be that they allocated both resources and political will towards their diaspora. And so my own background is as a sociologist, as is Xochitl, and Xochitl brings a lot of expertise in Latin American and Latino studies as well, which has been really helpful here. And so the book itself, if you haven't gotten a chance to read it, I'll just kind of walk you through the logic of the book, which is focused not only in the Mexican state, but also on civil society organizations on the ground that have worked for a long time to advance the rights of low-wage Mexican migrant workers in particular. And so the book starts with kind of an overview of the issue and the topic of Mexican migration to the United States, which I know has been a lot in the news in recent years, but really has arguably, a couple century long history. The second chapter, if you really want to understand the bureaucracy behind both the Mexican state and the foreign ministry, as well as kind of bilateral relationships between the United States and Mexico, really lays out what that looks like and how it came to be that we have a binational accord that is focused on labor protections in the United States and which holds both countries to account for collaborating on those issues, especially as they regard Mexican migrant workers. The third, fourth, and fifth chapters, which we'll touch on very briefly during our limited time today, kind of look at what it means to actually implement what turned out to be not only a week out of every year following Labor Day, where the two countries work together to educate and implement resources for Mexican migrant workers that are looking to access the rights afforded to them under U.S. labor and employment law. All of you maybe remember taking 2010 labor and employment law, which kind of lays out all the protections that all workers without much exception are supposed to have access to. And so what we're really interested in is what role not only both the United States, but also Mexico has played in making sure that those rights are respected, as well as different types of groups on the ground, which includes labor unions, worker centers, legal services organizations, and other immigrant rights groups. And so the third chapter is really interested in this concept of co-enforcement. In other words, what is the role of civil society in working with the state, especially for unions and legal services providers. The fourth chapter is thinking more broadly beyond the work site specifically. What are the interests and demands of low-wage, in particular Mexican migrant workers? And then the fifth chapter really thinks in a cross-border context at the role of both transnational advocates in the United States as well as in Mexico through different attempts at strategic litigation and other efforts to work across borders to hold both the U.S. and Mexico to account. So I'm going to say a little bit at front just to tell you about the research, and then I'm going to hand it over to Xochitl to talk about the meat of these chapters a bit. So just to start, as I mentioned, the issue, as ILREs, we don't have to spell it out too much, is that we have a number of different rights that are afforded to workers in the United States through the Fair Labor Standards Act, Occupational Safety and Health Act, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, all the things, as I mentioned, you all learned as undergraduates and perhaps also as in graduate school. And the reality on the ground is that the rights there's a lot of reasons why these rights are not respected, but the folks who are in particular places of vulnerability include low-wage migrant workers, the largest community of which are of Mexican origin. And so there's been a lot of work on the part of advocates to highlight the issues of quote unquote wage theft. And I put that in quotes because you often hear that called various different things, and especially occupational health risks. And so we know, for example, in the Bureau of Labor Statistics, when it was publishing such things, it would say, has had published reports that reveal, for example, that the group with the highest fatality rates in the United States are Hispanic foreign-born workers, for example. And so this has become an issue for these agencies who have a statutory obligation to enforce these rights, but for lots of different reasons, face challenges, getting access to workers, partly because of linguistic and cultural barriers, but also in particular, as we see more recently, because of the barriers that immigration law poses at the workforce. In addition to all of this, we know that there are lots of different just bread and butter barriers to enforcing labor standards across the board, including a diminishing budget. We saw some increases during the Obama administration, but essentially per capita, the resources afforded to big agencies like the DOL and the EEOC, et cetera, have reduced substantially over time since the creation of those laws. And most importantly, as you might recall, these laws are really only enforced once the affected worker comes forward to file a claim. And so if you have a huge barrier for those workers to feel comfortable doing that, then you as an enforcement agency, regardless of where you stand politically, have a problem because your ability to enforce that statute is limited. And so we in this country, as opposed to other countries, don't really have a huge both political will or existing bureaucratic resources to do strategic enforcement. And this kind of claims-driven approach becomes challenging, especially in immigrant-heavy industries. Wage theft is amongst the most common of the workplace violations, but there's a whole host of other things like discrimination, violation, sexual harassment, health and safety, so on and so forth. So one of the things that emerged from this, therefore, has been looking at ways to find pathways into these affected communities, given that we have lots of different both structural barriers as well as issues that prevent these agencies from effectively reaching out to these workers. Now, in comes the Mexican state. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, Mexico is the largest plurality of or national origins for migrant workers in this country with a long history. The Mexican Consular Network is the apparatus of the Mexican Foreign Ministry that provides resources, and there's lots of obligations that any government has to its co-nationals living abroad. So a range of issues, not only just workplace rights, but if you're on death row or if any of us find ourselves in jail in a foreign country, the idea of needing to call on your consulate is an important role. And they are diplomatic actors, who are limited in their ability to kind of intervene in the domestic politics of a place. But they're supposed to be, they have a mandate to engage in the protection of their workers. So the consular network is dispersed according, in many ways, to the population distribution of Mexican migrants in the United States, and it's shifted somewhat. For example, the Alaska office no longer exists. The San Francisco office covers Hawaii, so on and so forth. But this gives you a sense, and you can tell that it's concentrated in certain, places where we have large numbers of Mexican origin populations. And so one of the things that we wanted to do is to understand how this actor, the kind of the third leg of what's often called tripartite enforcement, what role that it plays on enforcing its obligations on the ground. And so we looked at this historically because this hasn't always been the case. There's lots of accounts going back to the beginning, for example, of the Bracero program, which is this 2-decade-long guest worker program where the Mexican government was not necessarily seen as the champion of migrant worker rights, was seen very much as a foe, very commonly would put people on blacklists and really was also, even much later than that, not necessarily particularly interested in putting resources or political will towards what were essentially seen as traitors for the nation, people who had left the country. And so that changed substantially, and Xochitl will talk a little bit about that. And that changed in part not because one day government actors woke up and said, we should pay attention to our Mexican compatriots abroad. It changed because migrant advocates on the ground kind of pushed and held the Mexican government to account through their work in civil society. And so we were trying to understand the role that civil society has played in the origin of these shifting political obligations, as well as on the ground in implementing the various binational instruments, which we'll talk about in a second. And most importantly, we were really interested in how this is varied across place. So if we go back to that consular map, not only is a concentration of diplomatic consular staff, concentrated in certain places versus the others, but you can imagine that the political, economic, and demographic overlay of those places looks really different. So we were looking at local variation. So just quickly to mention, we looked at this through a number of different data strategies, including an initial survey of all consuls in the country to try to get a sense of what role they were playing. And Xochitl will say a little bit more about this, but initially there was 15 consulates that agreed to partner together to create a week-long outreach strategy after Labor Day to engage in labor education and some service provision. And so we wanted to understand what role they were playing, and then the broader consular network who took on these tasks, not only during that week, but the rest of the year. And then most importantly, we talked with agents in U.S. government agencies, both at the federal and in some cases the state level, who had developed relationships with consulates, staff from the Mexican consular network itself, which was a real challenge because these are folks who kind of transition in and out. Career staff are moved all around. And the bulk of the interviews were with civil society organizations, as I mentioned, labor unions, worker centers, immigrant rights groups, legal services providers, et cetera. And in both the US, primarily Brooklyn, Baltimore, DC, as well as primarily in Mexico City, we talked to folks who were very explicitly working transnationally on legal and other strategies of advocacy. At the time this was done, I was actually located in California, and so I spent some time on the ground in these spaces. And Xochitl is a long-time Chicago resident, and so she's also done a lot of work ethnographically there. So just to set up, before I hand it over, the kind of the broad policy question here, and we're seeing this play out before our eyes right now, is that we have an inherent tension between, on the one hand, the federal obligation to all the things that you as ILR alum studied in terms of labor standard enforcement, and immigration enforcement priorities, which we have seen expand both in terms of political will and resources. And so there's statute, and there's also courts, including the Supreme Court, that have gone back and forth about which of these take precedent. So we don't have time to get into it all today, but we were very much interested in trying to understand how these priorities play out, and how the Mexican state navigates this, especially for undocumented workers. In the literature, there's been a lot discussed around this issue of co-enforcement, and this is where I'll hand over to Xochitl in a second, which means that, again, laws not only do they not implement themselves, but increasingly the implementation of them requires liaisons into affected communities through NGOs who have access to not only the migrants who are affected, but also the advocates who are serving them. And so this, as I've mentioned before, this tripart structure has emerged in a lot of different instances to help reach marginalized population and to provide greater input into the process of labor standards enforcement. So I'll hand it over to Xochitl now to talk a little bit about the history of consular advocacy.
So thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you to Shannon for getting us started on this journey of our book. And so I'll take over on the history of labor advocacy at the level of the consular network. So the consular collaboration that the book describes was possible in large part due to a 2004 Federal Memorandum of Understanding that was signed between the Mexican Secretary of Foreign Affairs and the U.S. Secretary of Labor. Secretary Eileen Chao was then in office. And later on, there were several subsequent accords with the state and local agencies that include, for example, EEOC, the NLRB, and OSHA, among others. So today, the annual Labor Rights Week represents the institutionalization of this transnationally co-produced labor enforcement cooperation. That's, as you learn, that it's like this tripartite co-produced enforcement at the transnational level. So what began as a pilot program with only 15 consulates, the one that Shannon explained to you that we started like contacting for making the big survey of all consulates. So these 15 consulates that were the pioneers has now spread to an annual event that includes all U.S. offices of the Mexican Consular Network, as well as the participation of several other countries with various bureaucratic capacity and diplomatic histories. For consular offices with a track record of labor advocacy, this week-long event is a formal recognition of these long-standing efforts. For those who had not been previously involved, the Labor Rights Week presents them with an opportunity for these offices to step into this role. And I wanna get you up to speed of what is going on right now. So the institutionalization still is there. The only problem in this conjuncture that we are experiencing is that the Department of Labor in Washington has not made the authorization for continuing signing the accords with the EEOC, OSHA, NLRB, etc. However, since this consular partnership is implemented at the local level, every consulate has made their best diplomatic strategies to make sure that this labor rights week continues, even in the absence of the formal memorandum of understanding that were usually signed. So this institutionalization nowadays, since the first pioneer labor rights week that happened back in 2008, now reflect a very important shift in the policies that in the management of the diaspora that Mexico can now be able to do in cooperation with not only the US government, but also with the government of Canada. And so this is now a very clear shift in Mexican policy towards immigrants, that now they are really caring, or at least they show that in the Labor Rights Week, at least for 1 week in the year, the same care they put in the workers in the Labor Rights Accord that they have with Canada, in the agreement with Canada, and that this new transnational management of diaspora leads to the creation of transnational advocacy network, which is something that we discuss a lot in the book. And we make a historical analysis of when these transnational networks emerge, and we find that the North American Agreement of Labor Cooperation that resulted after the NAFTA, or the original NAFTA, labor side accords that were signed by President Clinton, that paved the way for this participatory democracy framework or these transnational networks. The idea of having to petition through different governments to the national office, to their national offices in Mexico, Canada, and the US, made this empowerment of public interest groups, NGOs that were anchored to the Mexican, Canadian, or the US space, to really share information and documentation experiences in a horizontal way. So Shannon was explaining to you about strategic litigation. So they really made sure that they were pushing, using dual strategies, to push two governments simultaneously to pay attention to the plight of the most vulnerable workers. For example, they had initial victories with 2 H workers and 2 B workers. So the models of consular assistance that, going back to the Labor Rights Week, the models of consular assistance that we found in both our survey and our in-depth interviews with both the pioneer consulates and other interviews with diplomats that we were able to make, is that there are 3 main ways in which the consular assistance is offered through Mexicans in need. So the first one is the consulate as a one-stop shop. In this model, the consulate works as a clearinghouse that consolidates resources, information, and referrals to lawyer networks or NGOs. This model is mostly used in places where civil society is rather small, and there are few avenues to pursue cases beyond the labor enforcement agencies. This model predominates in cities with rapid demographic change, such as Omaha, Phoenix, Dallas, Atlanta, and Raleigh, where civil society networks are less mature. The next model is the consulate as educator and information disseminator. This is most common consular role across all the jurisdictions that we have the opportunity to interview. That's the most common display of cooperation. Most NGOs agree that consular educational efforts are the best way to inform workers, because they can have the opportunity of talk to workers in their own language, in the Spanish language. And they can disseminate basic rights either through conversations with designated consular staff or through events that are organized through the Labor Rights Week. This model is present in the 15 pioneer cities where the Labor Rights Week was first implemented, which is Atlanta, Chicago, Dallas, Fresno, Houston, Los Angeles, New York City, Omaha, Phoenix, Sacramento, Salt Lake City, San Diego, San Francisco, San Jose, and Washington, D.C. And the last model is the most comprehensive one, and it's when the consulate acts as a direct advocate. In this model, the consulate creates a network of organizations that meet regularly to discuss labor issues, and that goes beyond the week, the Labor Rights Week. So they do it on a monthly basis or bi-monthly basis, and so on and so forth. They have a very close working relationship with federal, state, and local labor standard agencies. The staff exchanges tips for building successful cases, and consuls use their diplomatic position to reach out to abusive employers directly before turning relatively easy to solve cases over to enforcement agencies. In this model, consulates are interested in prevention mechanisms, educating and empowering workers to avoid problems in the first place. These consulates develop very good working relationships with organizations that focus mostly on organizing at the workplace. We find this model successfully implemented in global cities with sizable immigrant civil society organizations, such as New York City, Houston, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Chicago, and to a lesser extent in Milwaukee as a result of the proximity to Chicago's consulates and NGOs. Something that we also uncover in our research is that this consular collaboration happens, but it has lots of challenges. And these challenges were relayed through us through the multiple NGOs that we interviewed, both like unions and worker centers, and also those who provide direct legal aid to the consulate to represent workers through the labor standard enforcement agencies. And so what we found here is that, for example, the local capacity of consular offices to participate in co-enforcement varies widely depending on the size of the jurisdiction they serve, despite the nationally coordinated strategy underlined under the 2004 Memorandum of Understanding that I already discussed earlier. Those are stretched thin. Often did little more than meet the directives than organizing a press conference during Labor Rights Week or the occasional resource and referral events. However, those with bigger staffs tend to adopt a proactive prevention outreach strategy throughout the community. Even so, these strategies are highly dependent on the experienced staff and are vulnerable to high consular staff turnover. In case you are not familiar with how the consulate operates in their network, like most staff, like the diplomatic consuls that are the general consul, the legal affairs consuls, the educational consul, and all these type of people that are registered through the diplomatic corps, they can only stay in a rotation of no more than 6 years on average. So therefore, all this wealth of information that gets to be created and matured between labor standard enforcement agencies, NGOs, and the consulate to do this co-enforcement, the tripart systems that everybody is working in cooperation, needs to be started all over again every 6 years whenever a consul leaves and there is a replacement of another general consul that brings their own staff. So all that trust that is gained needs to be started every time that there are these turnovers in the consular staff. So one of the things that we uncover also in the book is how important is variation depending on the place. So we realize that place is very important for understanding the evolution of enforcement patterns, as well as the factors that are shaping the policy implementation. It doesn't matter if it's at the supranational level, at the bilateral level, or at the national level. For example, in the case of labor standard enforcement, certain states and local policies will determine which enforcement strategies are relevant partners for co-enforcement. It depends, for example, on industry dynamics. It's very different the type of enforcement strategies that the Agricultural Labor Relations Board in California is going to pursue compared to the construction industries that are overseeing this relationship in the city of Atlanta, for example. There are very different concerns, so therefore the type of relationships that get forged are very determinant on where this co-enforcement, this transnationally co-produced co-enforcement is taking place. So also the size of the jurisdiction matters because the consulate has a very odd way in which they decide what is the size of a jurisdiction. The example that Shannon was explaining earlier, that the people in Hawaii needs to travel to San Francisco in order to get support for their consulate, it's very difficult to understand, right? Because if you see the map, there is like the only way that you can get support if you live as a Mexican living in Hawaii, in any of the islands of Hawaii, you have to take a plane in order to go to San Francisco. And in case you did not know, the Mexican population or the Latino population in Hawaii is now reaching 16% or so, more or less, depending on what island you are in. So the Latino population in that area has increased, mostly Mexican, and they can only get support like from San Francisco. So this is like very complicated for them to really have a good coordination. Okay, so something else that we learned while understanding the transnational advocacy networks, because this research, as you saw in the strategy, was carried out in mostly in these 15 pioneer places where the Labor Rights Week started, along with the survey across the entire Mexican consular network. But we also supplemented these interviews with those transnational advocates that were anchored in Mexico or at the border region. And this is where ultimately the biggest lesson from the transnational perspective that we learn is that labor rights advocacy never exists in silos and is not bound within the framework of the nation state. And while supranational instrument exists to ensure bilateral and regional cooperation, the only check to ensure this is happening is the advocacy of transnational advocates. And they use an array of strategies to bring broader demands, and mostly against the sending state. So they take this into consideration to bring this concept of portable justice, which is the idea that the workers will travel with the possibilities of having respect for their labor rights, regardless of where they are. And this idea of portable justice, according to those transnational advocates, need to have all sorts of arenas, not just immigrant rights, but human rights, agricultural rights, land rights, border activism, women, family reunification, etc. This is where we see that the collaboration and contestation across border is very real. So perhaps in the future, some of the issues that Shannon and I would like to keep working on is to see how these fractures between advocates that are anchored in Mexico versus advocates who are anchored in the US or in Canada, how they can improve their collaboration in more horizontal ways. Because they are very skeptical in Mexico that, for example, that the advocates are very skeptical of the Mexican government and to what extent they can support their efforts. But at the same time, advocates in Mexico sometimes are skeptical of their their brothers and sisters that are working also on advocacy efforts, because they not always trust that they will be equally transparent when sharing resources, for example. And there is like lack of horizontal possibilities of having access to the same amount of resources. NGOs in Mexico have lots of scarcity of opportunities of how much international funds they can have access to. So sometimes there is lots of jealousy and lack of cooperation in the type of transnational advocacy that is possible. So these are some of the fractures that we were able to hint at in our research, but this is something that we will continue to do research in the future. So next slide. It's like we would like to thank you for your time and invite you to ask us any questions you may have about this book or our future, or what are the future research agendas that Shannon and I have in mind these days, or anything that you want to discuss.
And just a quick reminder that the book is available for free. And we also have this partner website, which has additional information about the research process and lists information about our other collaborators as well.
Thank you. This was a great overview. And I do have some prepared questions, but I also came to mind thinking about the concept of portable rights and the consulates. Are there any similar frameworks related to other workers from other countries, for example, the Philippines or other countries that have a lot of labor that has workers that have come to the United States?
You want to try that? I can do it.
Yeah,
Xochitl?
I can try that. Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. The idea of the portable justice framework comes from meetings at the United Nations level, at the the Commission of Refugees and many other venues where the United Nations have attempted to improve the rights of migrant workers and their families. And every time that they have invited advocates, not just from the US, from all across the world, they have attempted to bring this portable justice framework for defending migrant rights and all sorts of rights that have to do with international jurisdictions. So, for example, in Cornell, both Beth Lyon, Shannon, remind me if it's Beth Lyon, along with the Justice in Motion staff, are the ones who have been credited to bring this framework to the international arenas, especially United Nations. But workers in Southeast Asia, the Philippines, and others also work through transnational advocacy networks that are pursuing this framework or portable justice. It's mostly theoretical at this point. We do not have sound evidence that could demonstrate that the portable justice framework has been adopted by states, because as you very well know, at the end, all policy happens to be local or national, and the sovereign state still reigns in making decisions on migrant rights. But yes, this is not only pertains to North America, but the idea of portable justice has been extended to many other multiple jurisdictions. So is that right, Shannon? Is there anything I missed?
Yeah, and I would just say that two things. I think one is that we often in the book refer to Mexico as the elder brother for the consular corps. And so as in many places where you have a very diverse Latin American in particular consular corps, oftentimes plus the Philippines, you see events being at least in its early stages, coordinated. I think the big lesson there is that the ability for those consular collaborations between different countries wanes over time, and it really requires leadership. And depending on whatever administration is in place and the priorities of the consulate themselves. In the case of the Philippines, there's a ton of people that have written about the Philippines, thinking about the migrant immigration process. I also have a student, Ashwin Kumar, who's been working on the case of India. Susie Lee, who's at Binghamton, has also written about Korea. which is very much in the news right now with the big raid at the Hanzai plant. And we're about to, I read somewhere, see a very slow burn on the diplomatic impact of that. So in each of those places, there has been not only the consular resources that have been relevant, but also just the curation of an immigrant workforce, training workers in the case of the Philippines, especially in healthcare. And in many of the cases of Labor Rights Week, the Philippines was one of the main actors in places where we see that diaspora really concentrated.
I think it would be helpful to talk about what you're seeing in the news and how that relates to, and any opportunities you see for workers, to work together or work with their home country, in the face of adverse, federal movement.
And then Hillary, just building on that too, another question, I guess, would be, um, given how we discuss that a lot of this is personality driven, right, and administration driven, seeing the changes that are also happening in the political conversation between Mexico and the United States and the different diplomatic, right, representation of those. How is that presenting itself in this current moment in time, right? Because we had talked about the book is going back a few years. And so some of those organizations, they're changing even in their constitution, right? Whether they exist or not and how robust they are. So just building on Hillary's piece, I'm curious about that portion of it too.
I'll say a few things, and then I'm going to hand it over to Xochitl, who both is an expert in the Mexican state and bureaucracy, but also who's in Chicago right now as a lot of these things play out on the ground. So a couple of things going back to the challenges. So, the ability of these diplomatic actors on the ground to intervene is often very limited, because they are supposed to remain non-interventionist and non-political. And so that's, I think, something that we're going to see formally probably not be fairly, as we said, muted. However, diplomatically, as these trade talks kick up and as we see these bilateral conversations happen, Sheinbaum and the Republic of Korea's leader are having conversations as well. And so these are complex bureaucracies where in the public eye you may not necessarily see confrontational conversations, but there's a lot else that, we're not necessarily international relations scholars, but where immigration has now become more prominent on the table. I'm going to turn to Xochitl because I think that she can also talk about also the role of the consulate in Chicago, but then also the relationship between civil society in places here who have a lot of experience not only holding the U.S. to account, but the Mexican government to account on issues of protection. So yeah, what are you seeing, Xochitl?
Well, what I've seen is that in the last Labor Rights Week, it was a very contentious moment because those who were advocating for agricultural workers and the ones that have taken a lot of deportations, they were very much, even those who were in the panel with the general consul, they were telling her directly that she's not doing enough. And so I think for that, she kind of measured the risks of saying what she decided to say in public. And she went ahead and said that she was disappointed that the Washington office, the Department of Labor, had not sent instructions to sign the memorandum of understanding, but she was very pleased to see that all labor standard enforcement agencies at the local level, imagine this is the state of Illinois that is very much pro-immigrant. So both Illinois OSHA, EEOC at the representative at the state of Illinois, NLRB, Illinois, the representative, Illinois Department of Labor, they were all seated front row, and she was thanking them for their bravery to show up for the Labor Rights Week in the absence of a memorandum of understanding that had not been signed with any of those agencies because the Department of Labor had not authorized it. So they were doing that's what I meant by the institutionalization. So they are moving forward with the co-enforcement of actions, but at the same time, this it was a good way of pivoting the attack that these NGOs were asking her what she is doing with Sheinbaum government post-deportation. They were very concerned about educational transfers for all these agricultural workers who have decided to get deported with their families. So not everybody will decide to leave their kids in foster care, right? Or in the care of neighbors. There are multiple families who decide that if they are going to be deported, this woman was also talking about voluntary deportations, that people who are deciding that this is enough, they cannot take it anymore, and they are taking their kids with them, and the Mexican government is not doing enough to swiftly accommodate them into Mexico's educational system, in spite of the fact that they always say that there is a transfer document that is ready to go, that have worked for 25 years in that transfer document, but the advocates were saying that this is not enough. So the consuls always have to manage expectations from NGOs, but at the same time, there may be other consulates, let's say Las Vegas or a consulate in Raleigh, where the civil society is not as mature as the civil society in Chicago, whose organizations sometimes date for more than 50 or 60 years, and who have really navigated lots of consulates. They really know how to put pressure, but in other contexts, like civil society may be a lot more muted. So in other words, like transnational advocacy works, as we say at the beginning, and it keeps displaying like that in as much as the civil society goes and pushes. And as much as civil society shows up at the consulate and tells the consul in public, at the moment that he or she has to save face, what are they gonna do to solve the situation right now? What are they doing to put enough staff on overtime so that they can visit all those who have been detained, and they can offer as much or as little as President Sheinbaum has ordered the consular corps to support them? So thus far, they have agreed, for example, to put they are discussing the possibilities of putting a radio show that it's kind of the continuation of our work through the book by doing popular education on labor rights in Spanish language. Like we did a series of 10 radio shows with worker centers. Many of them, well, all of them were interviewed in the book for the case of Chicago. And this radio show, the consulate is trying to put it on their loudspeakers while people are waiting for their passport, as another way of doing dissemination of education. Because many advocates realize that the problem is that many of these workers believe that they do not have any rights. Still today, it takes one at a time, this education of what you guys at ILR know very well, that the workers have almost equal rights regardless of their documentation. But for workers who are afraid and paralyzed by fear, they think that they do not have rights at the workplace. And so the consulate can educate one at a time as they visit their offices, but it takes time. It's a very long process to do that. And yes, in this week, like the consul is like really overwhelmed because they had to cancel the grito. This news that you heard, that these big vendors that were partnering with the Mexican government to sponsor a big cultural festivity downtown in Chicago. It was the second year that they were doing that after a long hiatus of not doing gritos in Chicago, like government-sanctioned gritos in downtown. They had resumed that last year, and this year the vendors canceled. And this is the grito, the one where the Mexican government is participating, that was canceled. So now the festivals are happening by neighborhood. The first one was successful. There was no arrests. The next one happens next Saturday in Little Village. And the consul is like gasping for air for all these this limited staff that she has, and all these protection, the legal department, which is very tiny. is a stretched thing these days, because it's not only labor rights, it's everything. It's family reunification, alimony, people in detention row, repatriation of corpses. Everything happens in just one department at all consulates. So these are very trying times for the city, especially because enforcement happened in full force yesterday, and there are more and more ICE agents arriving to the city.
Like, this is very emotional. Given the, this aggression, are you seeing any, assistance from employers or, employers to support workers or to improve conditions because they understand that people are, putting themselves at a heightened risk to show up?
This is a very good question, and what we hear in our collaboration through the radio show with worker centers, specifically Arise, they've done lots of training for having employers become sanctuary themselves. But the few employers who have decided to abide by the sanctuary idea of employers as sanctuary are very few. And the ones who have decided to do it is because, again, the pressure of the worker centers. I do not know the case of New York, Shannon, or I don't know if you have heard of worker centers pushing employers to make their workplaces as sanctuary.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a couple of things. One, I think employers are operating both individually and collectively through chambers of commerce because they're not thrilled with the current enforcement actions either. We talk about the policy of employer sanctions as it relates to employers in our book as well. So the chambers of commerce and even many kind of business-oriented organizations, like even the Cato Institute, have taken pretty strong positions in opposition to these and other longstanding enforcement actions and other policies like E-Verify, which we talk about. There have also been locally, and you're probably seeing this too, Xochitl, efforts, requests on the part of employers here in upstate New York. That's also a lot of growers and farmers and dairy owners, as you know. And there's a similar landscape outside of Chicago and meatpacking and much of the agriculture to try to understand what their rights are. So actually, for the first time, even here locally, our civil society groups are seeing requests coming from employers to say, train us. We want to know what our rights are. There was a raid here last Thursday in Cato, New York, and Rochester's also been in the news, given the raids that have been happening in Western New York, as you well know. And so it's not only large employers, but also, non-traditional small employers. So a lot of the raids that have been happening on homeowners, properties, for example, there's been a few different ones involving roofers. And so folks wanting to know what happens when ICE shows up. And, especially in a place, I'll say like upstate New York, those relationships with employers become really consequential. You may have heard, but our farm worker program was just shut down here at Cornell. Mary Jo Dudley, who many of you know, is retired, and effectively the work that they're doing has ended. And so this raises a bunch of questions about the institutional knowledge that she takes with her, and more importantly, many would argue the relationships with those employers that she developed to be able to have access to farms where not only people work, but where people live. And so this, I think, is going to have some long-term consequences in a place where kind of these more adversarial relationships between worker organization and employer organizations are more the norm. Here, there's a lot of codependence, not only on employers and these small networks. For example, the Schmidt family that owns the confectioner's factory that got raided last Thursday is very well integrated into that 600-person, community. And so it's going to be very consequential how they respond and how faith communities respond there. It is a Republican stronghold. And so, that's going to be, I think, a big part of the conversation.
So can sense two questions if you have time as we're wrapping up, but these are, I feel like, are more like silver lining or looking for how we can end on a more positive note of anything we could learn from sanctuary cities that expanded protections like in the past, or if you had seen where certain areas became more bastions for protection of workers' rights. And the second, despite the challenges, where do you see the greatest opportunities for progress over the next decade?
You want to go first?
Yeah, okay. So what are despite the challenges, the best the best things that they give me hope is the maturity of these transnational networks. Yes, we mentioned that they are in conflict at times, but I see lots of progress with the sharing of information horizontally. Little by little, they become a lot better organized. The ones that do Canada, Mexico, and the US, and they are better at exchanging information very quickly and pushing these dual strategies. And so both exercising pressure simultaneously and strategically to make things move in terms of migrant labor rights. And they are very much interested in increasing their capacities for educational dissemination. So part of the effort of creating this radio show was in conjunction, for example, with worker centers who agreed to the idea that with the influx of almost 50,000 new arrivals that we had in the city of Chicago in the last 2 years that were mostly monolingual in Spanish, there was no easy way of transmitting the basics of know your rights in terms of labor in the labor arena, with all the complications that you as experts of ILR know very well, how difficult it is to make workers understand the alphabet soup of all these labor standard enforcement agencies. So it takes multiple trials and ways of understanding and explaining to them. So, but there is lots of faith in creating communities of knowledge of where workers can become their own beacons of sharing this information and knowledge with others, especially new arrivals, and how they can really lend a hand for creating better possibilities of people knowing their rights and being ready to defend their rights. So I see hope in like sharing of information horizontally and transnationally, not just for advocates in North America, but for labor advocates across borders, like Southeast Asian with the North American ones. I see that happening more often, that they are really having these cross multi-country collaborations in education. And I leave it to Shannon for the sanctuary city one.
Thanks. I'll say something about the term itself. I think it's a popular political label, but in practice, really doesn't mean much. I often talk pretty cynically about sanctuary cities, not because I don't believe in the hope for it, but because I think people don't realize that the ultimate purview of immigration enforcement is at the level of the federal government, and that I think the two lessons for me kind of studying localities over time has been one, that the label of sanctuary city is fickle and changing. And so one of the great examples of this is in San Francisco, where Gavin Newsom, the current governor of California, currently has often like leaned on his experience as the mayor of a sanctuary city. What's often left out is that in the middle of his administration, he also reversed many of those policies following some really horrible tragedies involving a man who was undocumented who killed a young woman, and we've seen some of these examples elsewhere. And so, under enormous political pressure, he walked back a lot of those commitments. You also see that like even sanctuary, quote unquote, states have a lot of subnational variation. Governor Hochul, and even before that, the AG Eric Schneider had policies in place that prevented localities from engaging in cooperation with immigration enforcement. And we know that downstate is not upstate. And so those in practice policies are often are not respected, and with very little to be done about it, right? And so I think sanctuary cities are an important, the second lesson is that I think they're an important foundation for accountability. They create a really important foundation for groups who are advocating for broader protections and more resources, like Governor Cuomo was under a lot of demands from civil society that he created the Liberty Fund and a lot of other things that are insufficient but have been important to address legal services needs. The label allowed, advocates to hold him to account, and later Governor Hochul, but alone they are insufficient. The last thing I would say is that the sanctuary city model is not easily adaptable to all jurisdictions where just the kind of bipartisan consensus that has to be reached for anything to happen. I also do a lot of work in Texas and in particular in Houston. They don't use that term. They use the term welcoming city. And especially as federal threats to pull funding and all the rest emerge, this is going to be important. I'll leave it just on the final note, which is it's not just cities and counties, it's also campuses. We're having a big conversation right now, what it means to be a sanctuary campus, to what extent Cornell administration will or will not go to bat, and what the limits of their legal obligations are, not only to undocumented students, but for international students, which have also borne the burden of a lot of the changing policies as well. So active point of debate. Thanks for having us. We really appreciate it. And feel free to follow up with us if you have other questions or there's ways that we can support your work as ILREs and SELA as well, Ketty.
Yeah, on behalf of SELA, I just want to thank you and echo Hillary's words. I think this is so important. One of the reasons I was really keen on us recording this conversation is because I think, even as you were sharing what has happened, right, as it relates to the book, which is a history, it's one moment in time, right, that we were looking back right now where we are, and the learnings and the hopes, but also the realities, the challenges that are being faced. I think this is a conversation that a lot of people that weren't able to be with us in person today would be interested in exploring. And so again, thank you for the time. Thank you for your work, and really looking forward to continuing the conversation